Welcome! Today we're going to be stitching the woven wheel clouds for our Be Kind rainbow hoop. We're going to be working with this almost white color. It is 3865, that's 3865, and we're going to start by working with just 6 strands. So just the floss straight as it comes out of the skein, 6 strands. I've got a nice long section. We're going to start by making these spoke lines that are in the center of our wheel. Now, you can see a couple of mine are pink, and that's because I decided to change them up a little bit after I first traced, which is another plug for erasable pens, because I can just change my lines, and then all of this is going to disappear after. So if there were any tips or lines or corners that poke out, we're not going to be able to see them. So I'm going to be following my pink lines here. You follow whatever's in your pattern, whether it be 3 or 5 lines for these smaller ones. So I'm going to start here. Doesn't matter which one you start on, because we're going to be doing all the foundation lines first. So I'm going to come up on the outside of one of the lines and go down at the center. And then I'm just going to repeat for all the lines. It is much easier to go up on the outside and down in the center, because you're going to have all of these stitches end at the same point in the center. And to try and go up where there are other existing stitches at the same point is way harder than just squeezing your needle in there for one more stitch. So after I finish this one, I'm just going to jump to the closest line, which feels like this one. I'm going to come up on the outside, go down on the center, and repeat for all 5 of these lines. All right, I finished all of the lines over here, and instead of pulling my thread all the way over to here, you can see how this would make a white line that you probably will be able to see through the fabric. So instead I'm going to anchor off, and I want to make sure that it's a nice strong anchor, because these stitches are going to be pulled on essentially by our next stitches. So we want to make sure that it's anchored very well, and then I will jump over to this side and make all of the spoke line stitches over here. And now we're going to work on the weaving part of a woven wheel. So we're still working with 6 strands of floss. The difference is that I have cut my section of floss that I'm working with twice the normal length. So usually I work with about 3 feet, a yard or so of floss. Right now my floss is 6 feet long. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to thread my needle onto one end, and then I'm going to take the other end of this super long strand of floss and I'm going to hold them together. Then I'm going to slide my needle. It's easier if it's not all twisted. Slide, 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 slide that needle all the way until it is in the center. So my floss is doubled over from the center point all the way through down to this knot, down to the ends. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tie these ends together just in a simple knot. And this is going to make it so we are now working with 12 strands instead of 6, but we didn't have to do any extra difficult work to get 12 strands through our needle. So we just have 6 strands through the needle, but then we double it all over. Make sure that needle's in the center, and we are ready to start weaving. Now, in your instructions, you will notice that there is an order in which I recommend stitching these. Since they're close together, they start to fight a little bit with each other. So we're going to stitch them in the right order. So we're going to go first here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5 on this side. The other side is 1, 2, 3, and 4. And this should just help you be able to access all the parts. So I'm going to come up on number 1, and I'm going to come up at the very well, not at the very, because that'd be difficult, right next to the middle here. And I'm gonna pull my thread all the way up, nice long bit. And now we're gonna weave, and we're going in a circle. You can go clockwise, counterclockwise, whatever feels natural for you. And we're gonna follow the pattern of over, and then under, and then over, and then under. Now it's gonna be easiest to do this if you use the eye of your needle to slide under instead of the point, because the eye of your needle is dull and it won't catch on as many things as the point of your needle will. So I'm gonna go clockwise, and I'm gonna go over this strand, and then I'm gonna go under this one, the next one in our circle. So I'm gonna slide that through and then pull my thread all the way through until it lays snug. And then we repeat on the other side, not on the other side, continuing with our circle. We went over, under, over. Now we're gonna go under. Just poked myself. Here we go. Under. Again, pull that through until it's just snug to the center. We aren't pulling super hard because that will start to warp it. Just hard enough to get it to lay to the fabric. And then we continue. Over, now under. Now what I'm doing with my fingers can be hard to see from this camera angle. So I'm gonna explain it a little bit to you. So when I go over and then under, sometimes it can be difficult to get our needle out because we're coming up next to French knots that are taller or next to another woven wheel. So what I like to do is to push from behind to make a tower, and then I push from behind. See how my needle starts to float on this end? And then if I push it down on the opposite end of my needle, it gets even higher so that my needle can get up over whatever's around it. It can be helpful if you feel like yourself getting stuck. Now, as we get farther out towards the edges of this wheel, we're going to want to help guide our thread into place. So instead of just letting it pull straight over the top like this, we're going to go a little bit slower and help guide this thread into place along the outside. Use the previous stitches to help hold it in place. Over and then under. Over, under. And we're going to keep weaving over and under until we reach the outside of our little spokes. We're going to keep going until the spokes are all covered up. Hey, you can see that this one's getting close here, but I still need to cover up this guy. So I'm going to slide under here still, over and then under. That's going to cover up this bottom one. And you can see that I'm holding it with my needle so that I can pull with my hand without messing with this knot. Under, and then all I need to do now is cover up this top one. So instead of going under this spoke, this last one over here, I'm going to check out how the rest of this is looking. And I actually quite like how these edges are looking. I'm feeling like they're good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over this one and then under this last stitch into the fabric. I'm going to pull this down and do the same thing. I'm just guiding it to where it needs to be, making sure that it's playing along with what needs to happen. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the eye of my needle and I'm going to pull, gently pull these stitches back in place just a little bit. It's the beauty and the curse of a woven wheel, is that the stitches are just kind of laying on top of each other, when they're woven, so you have some give where you can adjust them to help them lay how you want. Downside is that if you catch them with your needle, they're gonna move. So you want to be careful not to catch them. It's why we've waited to do them until now, and then we'll be stitching below them where there's less chance of interacting with them. All right, so this was one, then we're gonna move to number 2. And so we're gonna follow the same process. This time we just have 5 spokes instead of 3. So I'm coming up in between 2 spokes, as close to the center as I can easily get. And I like clockwise, so I'm gonna stick with clockwise again. And I'm gonna go over and then under. Instead of shoving my needle straight into this flower, I could go down around it, or I could go up into the rainbow so that my needle doesn't try and catch on this woven wheel. All right, I'm feeling pretty good about this one. I don't want to overstuff the spokes because then our flower or wheel will start to look a little bit funny. So I'm going to cover this last bottom one here by going down in between the 2 spokes and under the stitches. And now I'm going to move to woven wheel number 3, which is this guy. You can see that I am basically to the end of my thread here. Got about a needle's length left. So I'm going to go down into the fabric. I could try and come over here and then anchor, but I know that anchoring under these stitches is going to be easier because all that's on the back of this are 5 lines, which is going to be a little bit harder to anchor to. So I'm actually going to back it up a little bit, and you can see I just went under this one. So I'm going to go down in between these, just right next to those stitches, pull down. I'll anchor off under these stitches here, and then I will get a new strand and we will start again. Now I'm going to come back up about the same spot that I stopped. Doesn't have to be exact. In fact, I didn't even lean over and check. I just know that I was between these 2 lines in the middle. So I'm going to come up about that same spot. Pull my thread all the way up. And I'm going to remind myself what just happened. I just went under, and then I just continue with the pattern. This one's over and under, and I continue going around. Okay, I'm feeling pretty good about how much everything is covered, with the exception of these 2 ends. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover this guy, go over, down into the fabric, pull a stitch down, just being gentle with it. Make sure that covers well, that I didn't move anything else that I don't want to. And then I'm going to come up over here, making sure to come from underneath. I don't want to come up next to, but underneath. Again, pulling that all the way up, and then I'm going to stitch over here. So I'm going to cover this spot and then go down under my woven wheel again. And this is going to help for any stitches that are spokes, cover up any spokes that are just a little bit uneven, because you're human, I'm human. One line might be a little bit longer than another, and that's totally fine. We'll just edit it a little bit here at the end. Make sure that everything is covered how we like it. And then we'll move on to number 4. All right, I've finished all of the woven wheels on this side. So now we're going to fill in some of these spaces, maybe a couple over here as well, to make this cloud feel like fluffy and full instead of like some circles hooked together. So we're going to do this by making some French knots. So I've just ended my floss right about here, so I'm actually going to come up here in the center first, And I've still got 12 strands is what I'm working with, because I've got that double strand, right, the floss through my needle and over. So this is going to make a fairly substantial knot, which is what I want, because I've got a pretty big space here that I want to fill. So I'm going to wrap this probably 2 times around my needle, and then I'm going to just try and be gentle as I get the knot to slide down towards the fabric instead of pulling it tight. And then I'm going to pull all of this very long floss tail through. And it looks like I have just this one teeny little funny strand. The rest seems to be playing along. Hold on. There we go. And there's a knot there. I think I'm going to make another one next to it. And now these knots are going to be a lot like our purple fill in that they don't need to be perfect. They're sandwiched right up against other shapes, so don't stress too much about what happens. We're just going for making a full looking cloud. So I'm going to grab 2, 3 this time. And then again, I'm just being gentle as I pull it down. I'm not trying to make it be super tight, so that hopefully my knot gets a little wider instead of just taller. Oh, good job. And I like how that's filling in this space. So I'm going to come over here and do this one. I think I'll just do 2 wraps over here. And this is all going to be personal preference. How big they are, how many you do, where you put them. I mean, if you like how it looks without the French knots, you don't have to add them. If you want extra French knots, you can add those. My recommendation when making French knots, especially ones that don't have a specific location, like these fill ones, is to do less first, tie off your thread, and then come back with a new strand. Because if you come back with a new strand, then you can unpick all the extra stuff that you might not have wanted. Whereas if these knots are connected to the next knots, it's much harder to tie off the loose end from the knots you want to leave rather than the knots you wanted to cut out. So I'm going to tie off, work on these woven wheels over here, and then we'll see if I need to make any more French knots. And there you have it. This side's done too. So now I'm going to, I have just 6 strands of floss on my needle. I went back down to just 6. And I'm going to add a couple smaller knots to fill in these other spaces that feel pretty empty, so that this feels like a solid cloud instead of an empty one. I have finished making French knots, and I feel pretty good about all of these spaces. And like I said, probably just a second ago, this last part is up to you. You can have a bunch of French knots, you could have no French knots, you could have only big ones and not little ones, or only little ones and not big ones. The choice is yours. The clouds feel done when they feel full and wonderful and just how you want them to. At this point, all we've got left is our lettering. So check back in for the next video. And until then, happy stitching.